My name is Sean Wildermuth, and it is about 2:40 in the afternoon today here in Atlanta, and I'm in my house. So one of the games I like to play when I do these Zoom talks is for everyone can take side bets in the chat window whether I'm wearing pants or not. So feel free to um, figure out whether I'm wearing when I say pants, I mean trousers. Sorry, I'm not going to talk about whether I'm wearing pants or not. I always forget the United States and the UK are divided by a common language. But let's talk about versioning. So what I want to talk about is first some strategies for versioning APIs in general, and then we'll dive into how you can accomplish it in ASP.NET Code. If you don't know who I am, I'll just put this up real quick so you can see it. I'm a Pluralsight author. I also have training at Wilder Minds Training, which is my company, and I've made a film which should be out this fall about software development, and that's about all I'll say about that. But let's start with what is API versioning. So once you publish an API, even if it's to internal teams, unless you have a really small development team, it should be set in stone in some ways. Once people have relied on an API by writing code to it, making willy-nilly changes can really upset people that have written code against it. And so your users rely on this API not making drastic changes, but your requirements to your system are likely to change. So we need to have a way to deal with these different changes, to evolve the API without breaking existing clients. And API versioning, as we're talking about it, is about not breaking these clients. Doesn't mean that every time you release a new version of your product that you should be releasing a new API version. Or vice versa. You may make small API changes before a product changes, so at point releases instead of major releases. And so don't think that you have to evolve your API just because your product changes. I suggest not tying those two concepts together. So the problem with API versioning is it's typically in .NET handled with different versions of the package. So you can think of this as assemblies or NuGet packages. An API versioning is more difficult because you don't have the ability to just ship a new DLL to somebody, a new assembly. And so your API needs to handle both old and new users in this way. Side-by-side deployment isn't feasible most of the time, so you're not going to want to have 2 or 3 or 4 versions of your application running somewhere. And so we want to have a way to support both versions with the same code base. And that's a big deal with API versioning. And it does mean that your job as a software developer is a little harder, but if it helps you keep your customers, so be it. So let's talk about there's a few different ways to handle API versioning. I don't suggest there is one that should rule them all. Some of them are more difficult to implement but have some other benefits. Some of them are simple to implement and have some cons that we should be aware of. If you find a mechanism that works for you and your company, you don't need to necessarily change that. So you're serving your client, not yourselves. So ultimately, if you're making money off your API, especially, that's the thing that's likely paying your salary. And so even if it makes it more difficult for you as a developer, I think that's okay. Hopefully what I'll be showing you will show you that it doesn't have to be that difficult. So the most common way that most people have seen it is using the URI to change the version. And this is probably the most common, especially early on, that organizations took with putting information directly in the URI. There's also a pattern of using a query string for an API. I actually prefer the second method if you're going to be looking at this. And I prefer it primarily because by changing by changing the URI, you are forcing customers to change their base URI for all the calls to you. I like the query string because there's this because query strings tend to be optional. They're not a required part of the URI, whereas putting the version in the URI path is certainly something that isn't optional at all. And what I'll show you will be able to handle both of these, but also we'll be able to handle versioning headers. Now, the issue with headers is that it typically requires a more nuanced developer to be able to get at the headers. Some developers, especially client-side developers, people that are doing JavaScript or simple applications, or even calling your API through things like Excel, might not be able to get at the header all that easily. So you have to sort of weigh using headers or not using headers. And another way you can do it is actually with the accept header. This is going to more complex. And in this case, we can use a version inside the actual accept header to point at whatever version you're looking at. And the last type is certainly the most complex, and that is using it with content type. The difference here is that if your organization or your customers are using the content you're giving them for a long time, this will allow them to have a content type that is versioned. So this isn't just about the API endpoint being versioned, but also the payload of the API being versioned. So if someone held on to this for 3 days and you happen to have an upgrade to the API, you'd be able to map this to the correct version of the API based on the data that was received. And that's not required in many applications, but know that this is a valid way of handling it in some very complex scenarios. This is actually a way before GitHub started to move to GraphQL of actually knowing how long you held on to the list of projects or the list of changes, so that if you called back into the API, they could have the same thing happen. So enough with the slides. Let's talk about API versioning in Visual Studio. I will have time at the end for questions, so don't be too worried. This project will be available. I'll have a blog probably tonight my time. So tomorrow morning your time, available with a copy of this code as well as the slides. So don't worry about trying to follow along. But this is a simple project I have that just returns some data. It's an API only project, and if we just run it, it's an ASP.NET 3.1 project, though. What we're going to talk about actually works in Web API as well as ASP.NET Core for APIs. And so over here in Postman, we can just see that it's just a simple customer API. If you haven't used Postman before, it's a simple way to construct and repeat REST calls as well as other calls. So we can see it's just returning some simple data and has a couple of APIs so that we can get at individual customers as well as individual orders for those customers. So nothing magical here. And right now, this is completely unversioned, right? If I make a change to the API, it's going to break anyone that writes code to it. So how would we do this? There's actually a piece of middleware. In Web API, you would wire this up a little differently, but I'll show the way to do it in .NET Core. Excuse me. And what we first need to do is bring in a NuGet package. And this NuGet package is not going to be installed. It's going to be here. It's .NET Core API versioning is a good way to find it. And we'll see these libraries from Microsoft. They're open source libraries for API versioning. And you'll actually see there's another one for just ASP.NET Web API versioning. But we're going to use the core version. If you go clockwise, the NuGet packages install faster. I don't know if you know that little trick. And we're going to do a couple of things here. We're going to actually add a new service here called API versioning. And this is going to take a configuration. This configuration has a number of things about setting up how you're going to do the API versioning, but we're going to leave this empty for now, just for the moment. We're going to come back to this. So let's go back to make sure we can build this, and then let's go back to our API. And if I call this API, I'm actually getting an error, 400 error, that says API version could not be found, because right now the API version is required, but none is specified. So in fact, if we came up here and said v equals version equals 1, I think that's what it's called. Nope. API version. Well, we're going to ignore that for a minute because we want to actually configure this. We want to say config.default API version equals what? So when someone calls into our API without specifying it, what's going to be the default version we're going to assume we have? In this case, that is going to be, we bring in the 1.0. Make sense? And we're also going to say configuration, assume default version if unspecified. So in this case, when someone calls without any version information, we're going to assume they want the 1.0 version of our application. So let's get rid of this query string for a minute. We're going to see it now is going to return because it's going to assume that if the controller didn't specify the version, that it's going to be the same as the default version. This isn't about assuming what calls come in, but assuming what controllers are using for versions. So what if we wanted to have a new version, right? Let's open up our customer's controller. We're going to do most of the work here. We can do this with attributes. So we're going to say API version, and then we're going to tell it what version or versions that it supports. So I'm going to say this controller can handle 1.0 and 1.1, right? So if someone comes in with either of those versions, I'm going to go ahead and support it. What we can also do is, let's come down here to where we get an individual ID. Let's say we have a need to have 1.1 different from 1.0. So 1.0 will see that returning an individual customer doesn't return the orders by default. But we want to change that behavior, right? So here we'll say that this one, we're just going to say map to API version. And in this case, say this is the 1.0 version of this. And we're going to say this is going to be the 1.1 version. So in our code base, we can pick, even at the action level, what to do with, what's the word I'm looking for? To have two versions handled even at the module level. So in this case, I'll just get rid of and add this include, where I go ahead and get the orders and items and products, so that when someone looks at a customer now, they're going to get all this information. And so let's see what this looks like. If we go ahead and send, we're still going to get null, because remember the default is version 1.0, and keep on forgetting what the default one. So let's change this so we can see what this actually looks like. So one of the other things we could do is configure how the API is read. This is where we can change between the different methods. by default, it's using query strings. And so I can actually say new query string API reader. And here I would give it the name, the one or more names of the parameter that could be used. And I'm just going to use VER for our version. So here I'm saying use the query string to define how it's read from our application, right? And so if I gave 1.1 in this case, we're getting all the order information, but if I go back to 1.0 or unspecify it, we're still getting that version, right? Because we're just using this one place to define how we're going to map these. And you can also have different versions of controllers that are mapping to different versions. So you might imagine another customer's controller that has mapped to 2.0, and then it would just call those. And so we can do these at a really whatever granular level you want. You can even do this by folder with this system, but that's not a way that I'm in love with. So let's talk, see how we're doing in time. Yeah, we have plenty of time. Let's talk about changing the format of this, right? So another thing we can do, and I'll leave this commented out for a second, is we can decide to just change this to new header API version, right? And I can go ahead and give it a name like X version. And so it's in the configuration that we're really defining how we're going to figure this out. So if I go ahead and do custom orders 1, of course, I'm still going to get that 1.0 version. And let's actually be sure that we're getting this by adding a couple more pieces of information. So I can say report API versions equals true. And what this is going to do for me is every time I make a request, and the response headers is going to say what are the versions, and it's called API reported versions, that are going to be supported by this API. And so it's going to read through those so it can indicate to the user which one it's actually using. So let's add a header to our request and say now X version equals 1.1. So we're just changing, I don't even want to say on the fly what way we're doing this. We're deciding which way we're going to read that version header. And there's also a configuration for API version selector. And this is where you would create an object that would figure out what versions of the controllers to call. Now, in this way, you can not have to use the attributes or some of the other ways to configure. You can just define with code how to pick the controller. I can hear one of you talking. If you don't mind muting your microphone. So let's talk about one more thing, and that is the idea of API version reader dot combine. What this does is lets me have more than one way of specifying the header. So API version combine says either of these are going to be okay. Give me just 1 second. Hope I could find out who was talking. And so in this case, this isn't an order that it's going to look at. It's only going to allow you to specify it in one way, but this will allow you to define the version when you're making the call in either way. So if we go back to Postman, you can tell we're using the X version here, and of course we're still going to get 1.1 because it is one of those two options. But if I were to come up here and say var equals 1.1 here, even though they agree, well, well, that's new behavior. Well, that's good. Let's see if it does it with 2, or maybe I didn't recompile it. Yeah. The old version required you to only specify it once, but in this case, we're seeing that these disagree, and so it's saying you're going to need to figure out which way you want to actually pass the version. And so in that way, we can decide or even allow different people to define it in different ways. The last thing I'll show you, we have about 15 minutes, is, where is it? Conventions. So conventions are a way to add specific version information outside of the attribute. I know that some people, when they see this and this, are maybe going to get a little uncomfortable with yet another attribute. It's sort of a culture difference with some organizations. And so what they've done is support the ability to create a new convention. And I'm going to cheat and copy some code so you don't have to watch me write all the convention information. Of course, I don't have it in my script here. So we're going to go off cuff. And we're going to say for controller, and I'll do the customer's controller. This is a fluent syntax that then allows us to specify. Why is it complaining about these? That is odd. We'll see once I finish this if it's still complaining. And then I can say for action, and when I'm specifying an action, I can either give it the action as a method info, or I can actually use lambdas to sort of describe it. So in this case, I'm going to say so what I'm doing here is I'm mocking up what the get looks like. So I'm creating a get that takes one or more methods. And this is really, so this action is being used to pick the right one. And then we can say has API version. And then we can repeat this for get 1, right? That's the name of the other method to say it has 1. And we'll add one more in here. Has API version. We're essentially saying this controller has support for both as well. So this is mimicking what we did with the attributes in a convention sort of way. And again, you can use conventions or you can use attributes, but those are the two major ways to actually do this. And if I haven't messed it up, to make sure that it's going to still support it. Yep, and if we go back to O, we should call the old version where the orders are null. So questions? feel free to use your mics if you want to ask anything. Let me see if I can get to the chat window. So what is my preferred method? I almost always use header or query string. I find them the least obtrusive. I really dislike the using the version as one of the sections of the URI, because I find that it ends up being fragile, and then dealing with minor versions, you end up really fighting a whole route table of ways to do it. And it also leaks with this particular system. It leaks information into your routes, because let me see if I can show this real quickly. I'm guessing I can't. You actually end up changing the controller here to include the other section, and it's something like ver API version, something like that. I don't think that's the exact right syntax, but basically a way that you can read the version and have it read through it. And I hate having to corrupt my my routes or change my routes everywhere for this. So that's why I don't necessarily recommend them. But there have been occasions where I've needed to use the content type or in order to version, because the shape of the payloads are changing a lot and people are holding on to our data for a long time. So I don't really think there is a method. Header is probably the one that I suggest, but again, depending on your user base, that may or may not be the best. Another question we got is, what method would you recommend, and is it best to just support them all? And I sort of answered the first half, but the second half is no, I would not support them all. I would pick one or possibly two and support them if you really need them, but have a strategy for your organization to version. The other thing I would say that's sort of related to that is version early and version often. Don't try to interject versioning once you reach a 2.0 version of your API, because then you're going to have to make sure it works all the time. So releasing it using this versioning system, because it's pretty simple, using this versioning system because it's pretty simple means that you should be able to do it as part of your standard new project sort of templates. I wouldn't wait until you need the first new version, because I want developers to be thinking about versioning. I don't want them to assume versioning is just going to happen magically. So another question was, do you know if we can do version match like ** or caret 110, sort of the semantic versioning ideas? Out of the box, no. But you certainly could write your own version reader that did that. So you could derive from the query string or the header or any of the other ones and write code that figured out from that data how to get at whatever version number is the current one. But that would be code you'd have to write. Again, not terribly difficult. This project is open source. It's out on GitHub, like most of what's in core. And remember that this does work with ASP.NET Web API as well. So if you're still working in .NET Framework, pretty much everything I showed you, except how the wire up to startup happens, is the same. The attributes, the readers, all of that are exactly the same. It also supports this idea of an API explorer that would also expose based on this information, being able to call those. Though if you're already using something like Swagger, you're going to get that sort of out of the box for free. I want to do both. Other questions? So I don't know how the side bets went, but let's see if I can see myself so I don't. I guess I should turn on. Oh, my camera's on. As I am wearing trousers. So whoever bet that I was wearing shorts, unfortunately, you were wrong. I hate to say that, but that's just the truth.